4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Women in ... a podcast created to talk about the accomplishments, accolades, trials, triumphs, and overall experiences of women in different walks of life. Last episode, we got into some stuff about female serial killers, which is always an interesting and kind of fun topic if you're into that kind of thing. This episode, the tone's going to be a little bit more serious, though. I want to spend some time talking about how our legal and justice systems inflict violence on certain groups of women, specifically trans women, and even more specifically, trans women of color. And we have a lot to get to, so I'm just going to dive right in. So before we sort of get into the stories and the ins and outs of legal system and police violence against trans women, I think it's important to first introduce Kimberly Crenshaw and make sure everyone has a brief understanding of the term intersectionality. So in 1989, Crenshaw brought to us the genius concept, that is intersectionality, which, in short, addresses the idea that people who possess multiple disadvantaged identity categories, such as race, gender, sexuality, etc., are subject to discrimination on the basis of a combination of the multiple identities that they might possess. And that was a mouthful. I don't even know if that made sense, really. But to put it another way, in her piece, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination, Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics, Crenshaw gives us an analogy to help us picture the concept of intersectionality in regard to Black women. She tells us to, quote, imagine a basement which contains all people who are disadvantaged on the basis of race, sex, class, sexual preference, age, and or physical ability, end quote. She goes on to tell us that these people are stacked, feet standing on shoulders, with those disadvantaged by a full range of factors on the bottom and those only singly disadvantaged at the very top. The only thing separating these people at the top from those who aren't disadvantaged at all is a ceiling, and in the ceiling is a hatch, meaning those that are only disadvantaged by a single factor or identity are able to pull themselves up through the hatch to the upper room. Everyone else is left below. This is all relevant to this episode because I'm going to be talking about violence against individuals that stems from the intersection of gender identity and race. And I know that was a really quick and brief overview of the concept, but I think that will do for the purposes of this episode, which is really just to bring awareness to the injustice and violence that I'm about to present to you. So without further ado, let's meet Monica Jones. In May 2013, Monica Jones was having a typical Friday night in Phoenix with plans to go out and hang with friends and have a couple of drinks. She was later approached by an undercover cop, though, who offered a ride that Jones accepted. The officer bothered Jones about prices, services, etc., which Jones explicitly responded to by letting him know that she had no intention to prostitute herself. She was continued to be harassed, and she asked to be let out of the car, but she was kept in the car until police arrived. She was arrested under the charges of manifesting prostitution, and she was later convicted in 2014. Now, her case is one of many in the widespread occurrences of Walking While Trans, a series of cases regarding the profiling that happens against trans women of color. So Jones ended up having her conviction vacated in 2015 due to the fact that she was not given a fair trial because they brought up prior prostitution charges that were completely irrelevant to the case. And that was a good thing, but the issue at large remained unchanged, which was the law that had her there in the first place. This law is ambiguous, among other things, and specifically targets trans women. So I think now is kind of a good time to circle back around and point out that this violence isn't just a trans issue, but it's a race issue as well. The way that sexuality is racialized in our society leaves room for trans people of color to face violence on a completely different level. There are specific groups of people that our society deems as worthy of protection, unfortunately. So every factor that someone possesses that's outside of this very rigid picture of our protected group makes someone more susceptible to violence. So this is why Crenshaw and intersectionality is important and why it's vital to understand that legal injustice and police violence is an intersectional issue. This violence isn't about one identity over another, but rather it's about hurting the people who possess a combination of non-white, non-straight, non-cis identities. So continuing on, what the Monica Jones case and so many others bring to light, and the key issue at hand here, is the profiling that's done by police officers against trans women of color and the other violence that this contributes to. So to fully grasp the way things are, I think it's important to acknowledge that this isn't something new or something limited to the present, but rather legislation posing violence against trans individuals has been in place for many, 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 many years. The root of the issue lies in our society's need to regulate sex and gender. There have always been these really strict rules about what you can and can't do, how you can and can't look, etc., depending on if you're a man or a woman. In Susan Stryker's 100 Years of Transgender History, we're given a list of different laws dating back to the 1850s that were put in place to regulate sex and gender and perpetuate violence against trans individuals. These came in the form of things like cross-dressing laws, harassment from the government in forms of postal surveillance, etc. And while all of that seems historic and you might think that our society has progressed and moved beyond such abuse, it's clear that this kind of violence and discrimination hasn't gone away, it's simply evolved. So bringing it on back to present day, where else are the police and our legal systems failing trans people? Well, the answer, in short, is everywhere, unfortunately. I've already talked about the police a little bit, and so to kind of circle back to that and talk about it a little bit more, the police are exhibiting violence in the form of profiling and criminalization, violence in the form of physical assault, violence in the form of sexual abuse, and even murder. One of the reasons that this is allowed to keep on happening is because of the laws that criminalize sex work. So these laws, they create a place of fear for trans sex workers and a place of free reign for the police to exhibit extremely violent behavior and abuse against the most vulnerable groups of people. Abuse can't be reported without fear of punishment or jail. Beyond these laws, though, are the continued perceptions people have of trans sex workers. A Stop Law Enforcement Violence Toolkit was created by a group called Insight, and they have a section dedicated to examining the policing of sex work. So these acts continue to occur often and without reprimand because, according to the toolkit, quote, violence and sexual assault against sex workers are routinely perceived by the police as a trick gone bad, something that survivors somehow brought on themselves through their sexually deviant conduct, end quote. So if we add race into the mix, trans women of color aren't seen as sexually deviant just because of their gender identity, but because of their race also. Black women are already overly sexualized and seen as more sexually mature or responsible for the things that happen to them somehow. This intersection of identities leaves trans women of color more vulnerable than anyone else when it comes to violence against sex workers. The perceptions about these women aren't just harmful because they're blatantly untrue, but also because they've grown into concrete forms of defense that protect the abuser and make the abusee somehow responsible for the violence they endure. Another prime example of violence against trans individuals at the hands of our government and legal system comes in the form of the things that happened to Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning is an activist and whistleblower convicted of violations of the Espionage Act and other offenses. This all happened when she was a U.S. Army intelligence analyst, and she sent thousands of classified documents to the website WikiLeaks. So what does Chelsea Manning have to do with our podcast episode? Well, Manning was raised as a boy and eventually identified as gay, but after her trial and sentencing, she came out to the public as female. Manning's trans identity was then used against her as a weapon over and over again. In pathologizing and prosecuting a gender traitor, Mia Fisher says, quote, Manning was mainly pathologized for her gender nonconformity and her inability to properly perform heteronormative whiteness, end quote. In the media and throughout the rest of her trials, a narrative was crafted to undermine Manning's credibility, make Manning appear to be mentally unstable, a threat to state interests, a terrorist, and all of this stuff, because of her sexual and gender nonconformity. So she sought help while she was in the military regarding her struggle and with gender identity and sexual orientation, and she was refused treatment. She suffered terrible treatment while she was detained. She was not given a fair and speedy trial by any means. She was denied other rights and privileges granted during trial proceedings. There was a real classified nature surrounding her pretrial hearings, meaning the media wasn't even allowed phones or other electronics. Court documents were held, among other things, and we could go on and on and on about Manning's story and her experience, but to sum it all up with another quote from Mia Fisher, Manning's treason and her ineptness to properly enact white heteromasculinity rendered her an othered alien enemy, a domestic non-subject, who was denied access to civil and human rights, end quote. So If nothing else, the reason I bring up Manning's experience to you guys is because this kind of othering and ripping away of a trans person's rights is common on so many levels, as I've tried to make apparent to you guys today, but it's important to recognize how it's done at even the highest levels of our legal systems. So what do we even do about all of this? I mean, where do we even start? And I don't think there's a clear-cut pathway towards an all-encompassing solution by any means, but I do think that it starts with making yourself and others around you aware, first of all, of the injustice happening every day. It's really easy to overlook things that aren't happening to you or to the people in your life, but that doesn't mean we should turn a blind eye to those who are suffering at the hands of a system that many of us are able to use to protect ourselves. And maybe there isn't a specific list of steps for everyone to follow that will lead us to justice, but there are some things that we definitely should not do, even though to some people these things probably sound like a perfectly reasonable idea. What I'm kind of talking about here is the way in which certain LGBTQ+ organizations are leaning on the help of law enforcement to help their communities. Like I've already talked about, law enforcement is responsible for so much of the violence and the hate and the injustice. The answer does not lie in stricter hate crime legislation or advocating for more police in certain neighborhoods, because that isn't going to help the trans community at all, specifically trans community of color. Rather, it's going to place more power into the hands of the abusive individuals that we're trying to stop in the first place. Where people of privilege might see a solution or a form of safety, other marginalized groups see one of the most dangerous working systems in our society. So that's a big what not to do, but what can be done. While the National Center for Transgender Equality put out a Blueprint for Equality, Federal Agenda for Transgender People. One of the chapters is titled Reforming Police and Ending Anti-Transgender Violence. This chapter lists a lot of needed policy changes, including passing the End Racial Profiling Act, implement the Violence Against Women Act's non-discrimination provisions, and so on. There are clear and concrete changes to be made on the level of law and policy. People are out there doing that work. And that's clear. It's up to us as individuals or groups on a smaller scale to kind of make ourselves educated, spread the word, and lift up and advocate for this work to be done in our own smaller communities the best that we can. But yeah, that is all I have for you guys on this episode of Women in ... I hope you enjoyed it. I hope maybe you learned something. I hope you feel empowered to share this with others. But yeah, check back soon for another episode of me talking about women, because what more could anyone want to listen to?